Rather, Marx grounds the historically dynamic character and structural changes of the modern world in imperatives and constraints that are historically specific to capitalist society, even though people in capitalist society have projected that onto the world. Far from viewing history affirmatively, Marx grounds the directional dynamic in the category of capital, thereby grasping it as a form of heteronomy, as a form of domination. His critique, then, is not undertaken from the standpoint of history and labor, as in traditional Marxism. On the contrary, the historical dynamic of capitalism and the seemingly ontological centrality of labor have become the objects of Marx's critique. By the same token, Marx's mature theory no longer purports to be a transhistorically valid theory of history and social life, but is self-consciously historically specific itself, and calls into question any approach that claims for itself universal transhistorical validity. The critical thrust of Marx's analysis in this reading entails a critique of totality and of the dialectical logic of human history as expressions of the temporally dynamic form of domination characteristic of capitalist society, and it seeks to uncover the conditions of their overcoming. This differs fundamentally from post-structuralist critiques of totality that insist on the ontological primacy of contingency. Marx's critique of heteronymous history differs fundamentally from such approaches inasmuch as it does not regard such history as the result of a narrative, a master narrative, that can be done away with discursively, but as the expression of a structure of temporal domination. From this point of view, any attempt to recover historical agency by insisting on contingency in ways that deny or obscure the temporally dynamic form of domination characteristic of capital is ironically profoundly disempowering. These contentions are based on a reading that considers the most fundamental category of Marx's mature critique with reference to the heteronymous dynamic that characterizes capitalism. Within the traditional framework, categories such as value, commodity, surplus value, capital, have generally been taken as economic categories that affirm labor as the source of all social wealth and demonstrate the centrality of class-based exploitation in capitalism. Such interpretations attribute to Marx a transhistorical understanding of labor as an activity mediating humans and nature, which is posited as the source of wealth in all societies. In capitalism, within this traditional framework, labor is hindered from being fully realized. Emancipation would be realized in a society where transhistorical labor has openly emerged as the regulating principle of society. This notion, of course, is bound to that of socialism as the self-realization of the proletariat. Labor here provides the standpoint of the critique of capitalism. A close reading of Marx's mature critique of political economy, however, calls into question the presuppositions of this traditional interpretation. First of all, Marx indicates that his fundamental categories should not be understood in narrow economic terms, but as forms of being, what he calls Daseinsforms, determinations of the mode of social existence, historically specific forms of social being that are at one and the same time subjective and objective. Moreover, and this is crucial, those categories should not be understood as transhistorical, but as historically specific to capitalist society. Even categories such as money and labor that appear transhistorical because of their abstract and general character are valid in their abstract generality only for capitalist society according to Marx. This applies to the category of value as well. In the Grundrisse, Marx explicitly presents value as the foundation of bourgeois production, but he doesn't do so in terms of exchange, but as a form of wealth historically specific to capitalism that is constituted by direct human labor time expenditure. He distinguishes value from what he calls real wealth, which is a function of the output of goods and is based on a number of natural and social factors, including knowledge. Marx proceeds to outline the fundamental contradiction of capitalism as one between value and the results of its own development. The dual character of capitalism's underlying social forms generates huge increases in productivity, which give rise to the historical possibility that value itself could be abolished and that production could be organized on a new basis, one not dependent on the expenditure of direct human labor in production. At the same time, however, value remains the necessary condition of capitalism. This contradiction between the potential generated by the system based on value and its actuality indicates that for Marx, the abolition of capitalism entails the abolition of value and value-creating labor. This implies that far from signifying the self-realization of the proletariat, the abolition of capitalism would entail the self-abolition of the proletariat. Volume 1 of Das Kapital is the rigorous elaboration of this analysis. It begins with the category of commodity, which is treated by Marx as a historically specific social form that constitutes the defining core of capitalist modernity. It does not refer to commodities as they might exist in other societies, and it does not refer to exchange. But rather it is a structuring principle of capitalist society characterized by a historically specific dual character, use value and value. Marx sought in Das Kapital to unfold the nature and underlying dynamic of capitalist modernity from this point of departure. At the heart of his analysis is the idea that labor in capitalism is not only labor as we commonsensically think of it, as an activity mediating the interactions of humans and nature, what he calls concrete labor, but also has a unique socially mediating activity, what he calls abstract labor, that is not an intrinsic feature of laboring activity as such. Let me try to elaborate. In a society in which the commodity is the basic structuring category of the whole, labor and its products are not socially distributed by traditional norms or overt relations of power, as is the case in other societies. Instead, labor itself replaces those relations by serving as a quasi-objective means of obtaining the products of others. In serving, that is to say, labor not only mediates production, but it mediates distribution as well. In serving as such a means, labor and its products, in effect, preempt that function on the part of manifest social relations and replace them. In other words, in Marx's mature works, the notion of centrality of labor to social life is not a transhistorical proposition. It refers to the historically specific constitution by labor in capitalism of a form of social mediation that fundamentally characterizes that society. According to this analysis, the real social relations of capitalism are very different from the qualitatively specific overt social relations, such as kinship relations, that characterize other societies. What ultimately structures capitalist society is a form of social relations characterized by an abstract, quasi-objective, formal, general, homogeneous dimension. This is the real social relation. It doesn't hide the real social relations. The abstract character of the social mediation underlying capitalism is at the same time expressed by the form of wealth dominant in that society. As I noted above, Marx's labor theory of value frequently has been understood as a labor theory of wealth, one that argues that labor at all times and in all places is the only social source of wealth. Marx, however, analyzes value as a historically specific form of wealth, which is bound to the historically unique role of labor in capitalism. In Das Kapital, like in the Grundrisse, he explicitly distinguishes value from material wealth, which is measured by the amount produced and is a function of knowledge, social organization, and natural conditions in addition to labor. Value is constituted solely by the expenditure of socially necessary labor time. I'm going to skip a sentence. Now, this is going to be a little complicated, but if it hasn't been already, I want to draw your attention to the significance of Marx's determination of the magnitude of value in terms of socially necessary labor time. This is not simply descriptive, but it delineates a socially general, compelling norm. Production must conform to this prevailing abstract, overarching norm if it is to generate the full value of its products. The time frame, that is the hour, for example, becomes constituted as an independent variable. Incidentally, for those who don't know, the hour before the 14th century used to change with the seasons. It was not an independent variable. The hour as an independent variable emerges with the very slow rise of capitalism, but that's